Todas y a todos, bienvenidos a este diálogo por la
Hello,
seguridad social
everyone.
en el
Back,
contexto del cambio
we're back
climático,
to this
en la segunda jornada de la Semana
CIS's
de la Seguridad
second
Social
day
en el Foro
of the
Interamericano
week
de Seguridad
of
Social.
Social Security.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this dialogue on social security in the context of climate change, in the context of the Social Security Week 2014. El día de hoy tendremos un panel con
Today
invitado
we'll have a panel
de
with
lujo. Para
incredible
esto tenemos a nuestra moderadora, Verónica
guests.
Zamudio.
Here we'll have Veronica Zamudio as a moderator. Could you please introduce yourself? I don't think I'm getting audio.
Ya, ya lo logré encender. Gracias.
Thank you.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos y a todas que nos
Hello,
acompañan
everyone,
de forma
for
presencial
being with
y
us
vía
both in
remota
person
en estas
and remotely.
instalaciones.
It is a
Ya les
pleasure to be
decía,
with you to
este
present
diálogo
this
hemos
dialogue
bautizado
that we
Diálogo por la
have
Seguridad Social en
created
el contexto del
for
cambio
Social
climático.
Security in the
Primero
context
me
of climate
gustaría
change.
presentar a nuestros
I will
panelistas
first of all
de honor.
introduce our members of the
El
panels,
documento que
the
vamos a
presenter
presentar
of
es
the document that we will have, which is a
titulado
meta paper
Político
called
de
Facing
la
Climate
Ponderación
Change: How
Social,
to
la Mitigación,
Support
la Protección
Buffering
Social y
and
Políticas
Adapting
Laborales y de
Social
Empleo.
Security in the job
El
and
autor de este
employment measures.
documento
The
es
author of the
Quinn
document
Fleming.
is Quinn
Lleva
Flemings,
más de 20 años
who's
en el
working
Servicio Público Federal
more
de
than 20
Seguridad
years
Social.
in the federal Belgian
Es
social
responsable del
security system.
desarrollo
He is
científico y
responsible
administrativo
for
de la
scientific
política
development
pública.
and has been part
Asimismo,
of
conoce
political
los
reforms
avances de
and
la
has
integración de
boosted
México en
the
Socio
Belgian
Plus,
Association of
el mecanismo
Socio
europeo
Plus,
para compartir
the
los conocimientos
European
sobre la
mechanism to
protección
share
social
knowledge about
con los
social
estados
security
de
with
la Unión
member
Europea.
states of the
Es
EU.
el coordinador
He is
del
currently the
programa de
coordinator of
avances
the
y conocimientos de SocioMás.
development
En
of
este
knowledge of
contexto
Socio
es que
Plus.
escribió este metapaper
Within this
titulado
context,
Político
he
de la
wrote the
Ponderación
meta
Social.
paper that interests
Dedicó
us
su
today.
carrera al desarrollo de
He
la
has
investigación social como académico y
dedicated
como
his
asesor
career both
científico.
as academic and political
Defendió su doctorado sobre el
evaluator. He
desarrollo
has a
y el
doctorate
impacto
degree
del
on
bienestar
the
en
development
Europa
of the
en la
well-being
Universidad
state in
Católica de Lovaina, Bélgica,
Western
y
Europe in the
posteriormente
Louvain
en el
University,
Centro de Políticas
and
Sociales,
he
donde
began
pasó a
on
trabajar para hacerse
its
organismos
career, among
transnacionales
others,
del
in
Este,
the
donde
Transnational
además ha
East
colaborado en el informe de la
Center.
OCDE
He has
de
worked in the
Ingreso
OECD
Mínimo.
report on
Bienvenido.
income inequality. Welcome.
Asimismo, contamos con la participación, con la presencia
We
de Landy Sánchez Peña,
also
quien es
have Landy
profesor e
Sanchez
investigador
Peña, who is
del
a
Centro de
professor and
Investigación
researcher
Demográfica
of the
del COLMEX.
Demographic, Urban, and Environmental Studies
Ella es
from
doctora
Colmex.
en
She is a
sociología por la
doctor
Universidad de
in sociology by
Wisconsin-Madison y
Wisconsin-Madison
su
University
especialidad
with a
es
subspecialty in
trabajar
geography.
en temas de población
She
y medio
works
ambiente,
in population and
especialmente en
environment
temas
topics
de
and
dependientes y
several
de la desigualdad social.
branches of social
Datos sobre la
inequality,
dimensión espacial y
such as
territorial,
spatial dimension,
demográfica y de género.
work
Sus
disparities, and
temas de
gender
investigación
disparities.
actuales
Currently, she is focusing
son
on
sexismo
two
laboral,
main
las
subjects.
intersecciones entre el
Firstly,
cambio
the
climático
intersection between
y el
climate
bienestar de los
change
hogares y los
and
impactos de los eventos
well-being and the
extremos
impact of
en las
extreme
poblaciones
impacts in
urbanas
urban populations,
y políticas de
as
adaptación
well as
de
adaptive
género.
policies
Por otro
with
lado,
gender
estudia las
sensitiveness.
desigualdades entre
She
sexos
also
y
looks at the
discriminaciones en el
sex
trabajo remunerado y no
disparities
remunerado
and
y la
the
dinámica de cambio.
paid and non-paid
Integra
work.
diversos comités
She
académicos
is
y
part of
editoriales en
different
diferentes
academic and editorial
organizaciones y es
means of
miembro del
communications, both
Sistema Nacional de
domestic and
Investigadores del
overseas, and
Instituto
she is
Nacional.
part of the
También
National
desempeña por demás
Network
funciones
of
al haber
Researchers.
ostentado el cargo de directora
She
del
has
Instituto
also
Nacional
worked
de
as
Investigaciones
director of
Económicas y Ambientales del
the
CONICE de México.
Colmex
A su vez,
Environmental, Urban, and
está la
Demographic Center of Studies. We
participación
also have
de
remotely the participation of
Débora Ann Ruiz.
Dr. Deborah
Ella
Ann
es
Rees,
diputada ejecutiva
who is an
por más de
experienced
42
executive with
años
over
en
42
programas
years of
parlamentarios de
experience
la
in the
Seguridad
area
Social.
of
Ha
Social
ocupado
Security.
diversos
She has held several charges in the Belize Fund of Social Security, such as the management of information systems, the management of registry of beneficiaries, the industrial relationships, and others. She also has worked as general director during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. She is currently working as a general director of the Social Security Board of Belize as of 2021 to this day. Deborah believes in social protection, the strengthening the abilities of leadership, both at the initiative, public and private. Let's welcome every single one of you. And thank you for being part of this panel. And with no further ado, I will tell you how we will have this dialogue. First of all, we will have a 10-minute presentation by Kuhn, the author of the meta paper, and then we will have comments on Deborah Ruiz during 12 minutes, sorry, and then we will have the floor for Landy Sanchez up to 12 minutes. Later, we will have a Q&A session, and afterwards, we will have a discussion on the meta paper, and the author himself will present the work of SocioPlus about the development of knowledge. With no further ado, we will have the floor for Kuhn.
Thank you very much, Veronica, also for this opportunity to share my work with all of you. So I work for SocioPlus. So it's a European facility financed by the European Commission and Belgium, France.
I'm not hearing the audio very well. I don't know if we could turn it up a bit.
Can you hear me now?
A little better.
Okay.
Técnico, ¿nos escuchan ahora? La señora
Yes, I can
Débora.
confirm. We can hear.
I am here, but the sound is very low. But I don't want to keep back, but I'm not hearing.
Okay, señora Deborah, please switch the translation in Zoom. In the original audio in English, please. ¿Puede escucharnos ahora? Más fuerte.
Can you
que
hear us now? A little bit better than previously?
You can go ahead and I will settle the audio. I can hear you, but faintly.
Gracias.
Everybody can hear me well now? Yeah, well, as I was saying, so Saussure is a facility financed by the European Union, Belgium, France, and Spain. And it's a technical facility aimed at providing technical cooperation on the subject of inclusive social policies, labor markets, and employment policies. So it's a demand-driven facility. So we only work on the request of partner countries, and it's focused on peer-to-peer, so public sector to public sector cooperation. And so, but we have done many activities in the past, about 600 of them, in total about 20,000 expert days. And the purpose of knowledge developers is really to valorize, to make this knowledge accessible to everybody. And so one of the things we do is drafting these meta papers. And so the objective of a meta paper is to valorize these actions. And so I wrote one on the role of social protection and employment policies within the context of climate change. And so I made a broad overview of all kinds of policies that have been implemented around the world within the context of climate change. And so to get a real idea of the practical issues. Because that's the aim of Saussure, is really to provide practical assistance on policies that work. And so, this report is now available in Spanish and in Portuguese, if you take a look at it, if you're interested in it. And so, of course, the context is climate change itself. Climate change is a reality and has a huge impact both on nature and humanity. And about, more than one third of the population of the world is vulnerable to the consequences of climate change. But these consequences differ across continents and countries. There are different conditions around the world. And also there are differences among groups of people. So certain groups of the population are more vulnerable to the consequences of climate change. And so a lot of countries have already been affected by the consequences of climate change. So over the last 20 years, we have seen many climate-related events and disasters. Some countries that are more experienced already in experiencing all kinds of climate weather issues, see these issues be aggravated by climate change. And so we have a lot of experience already in the world. It's not a new thing. We are already confronting, as we speak, climate change. But there are large differences around the world also in not only in exposure to climate change, but also to vulnerability. We see that in African countries, the vulnerability is very high because they don't have the resources to confront many of the consequences of climate change. You have countries that are quite exposed to climate change. Mexico, Colombia is among them, many countries in Asia, but many of them have better resources also, so they are better able to deal with it. Climate change is, of course, also a social risk. And so because, first of all, the exposure to the consequences of climate change differs among population groups. Some of the vulnerable population groups are also more vulnerable to the consequences of climate change. They're more exposed to it. Often they live in in areas that are more risking to be affected by flooding, by heat waves, and so on. So often they are really more exposed. And on top of that, they're also more vulnerable. So they don't have the resources to confront the consequences of climate change, and they have difficulties to adapt. And we see also that vulnerable groups are also more vulnerable to the policies that are aimed at mitigating the future impact of climate change. And so, for instance, energy taxes and so on, they affect the poor more than others. So they're also more vulnerable for that. And so that means that social protection has an important role to play within the context of climate change. And in fact, we see that it is really one of the driving forces in social protection nowadays. So what can social protection do to address climate change? Well, first of all, social protection reinforces the resilience of the population. We are good at that with social protection. Social protection has been built to protect people, to make them more resilient to the risks of life, the sickness, disability, unemployment, and so on. So that's why social protection was developed. But it was also, it's not only for, it's not only for individual risks, but also it buffers against crisis. We've seen that in the past, the financial crisis, there you see that social protection played the role of buffering the economy and people against the impact of these financial crises. And more recently, the COVID crisis, we see how much impact that had, how important social protection was there to protect our peoples against the impact of that pandemic, and also the socio-economic impact of that pandemic, not only the health issues. So it's really important to increase resilience, and also it's also important to support people during such crisis. And you have one of the impacts of climate change is, of course, you have more risks and more risk of disasters. And so social protection can reinforce the resilience. And so, like I said, we have done that in the past. And also, but then the issue is, of course, that the better coverage we have of social protection, the more universal the coverage is for social protection, the more resilience we can offer to people. So the coverage is very important in the context of climate change. And that's a good thing, because I think we are all aiming to improve that. Then also we provide, next slide, please. We provide support also to during a crisis. So we can adjust our protection systems to provide more protection during a specific crisis. There again, we have traditional social protection already has quite some instruments to do that. We can also help people reorient during a crisis. And so it's really, we can provide a lot of support to people, both during a crisis and also during changes that are related to slow onset climate events. You see that some regions become less habitable. Sometimes, so Mr. Solana of Costa Rica mentioned migration. So some regions become less livable. Some crops cannot no longer be produced. And there we can also help through social protection and also employment policies to reorient people and to help them find a new way of living, and so to support them during this slow onset crisis provoked by climate change. Next slide, please. And so there are many interesting techniques, but that many of us also used during the COVID pandemic. For instance, we can increase the coverage temporarily of our social protection systems during a crisis. We can try to cover more people when there is a crisis. We can also supplement the benefits that we provide temporarily to allow people to better cope with the crisis. And also the administrative resources of social protection are really important. We can use these administrative resources of social protection to better target people that are affected by events related to climate change. So this piggybacking, so using what is there, the administrative system of social protection schemes, to provide assistance targeted related to climate change. And also, but the
And so you can also try to implement more automatic mechanisms to address the vulnerabilities associated with climate events. And so in that context, there are many examples around the world. And so the idea of the meta paper was to give really an overview of what is already there, what are the practical experiences of the countries around the world with climate change. And one of the things also is the importance to have an integrative approach to what is already there. Social protection is already good, is already useful within the context of climate change, but it works better if you integrate it with disaster relief, and also when you integrate it with, with plans to address climate change. You really have to integrate that in your planification, and few countries do, in fact. Next slide, please. And also within the context of the decarbonization, the green transition, social protection can also provide help with that. I mentioned energy taxes that are sometimes associated with green transition policies. We want to decarbonize our economies, and there also social protection can provide support so that the more vulnerable parts of the population are less affected by these policies. Sometimes it also means that we have to restructure our economy to make our economy more greener, to decarbonize our economy. That means that we have to help people so restructure their activities. Green jobs are important, so providing assistance in developing green sectors, green jobs is quite important. Helping people that are affected by job losses because of the decarbonization, that are losing their job because some heavily carbonized industries are being closed. There as well, social protection already has quite some experience in addressing these issues of economic restructuring and can also be of help. Next slide. So, and so we have, you can compensate people for the impact of policies. Like I said, also the green jobs. You can also influence people through policies to adapt green behavior, for instance, preferring reintegration into green jobs. And so, so there is a lot of things that can be done through social protection within the context of the green transition. And then what we hear more and more, we read about eco-social policies. That is really an integrated approach to the challenges of both social protection, the economy, and climate change. And so there's a lot of research work being done on that subject. And so, but less experience with actually policies that have been developed within that context. So, but it's also, I also mentioned it in the meta paper. And so I also have a long list with references that you can use during your own work. And so I try to really have an inventory of everything that is available on that subject. Next slide, please. So the main lessons learned, well, coverage is important. Having a good social protection coverage and approaching universal coverage really help, because it makes your economy more resilient, and you provide, give more broader support to your population within the context of climate change. An integrated approach is really important. So try to also link it up with other, planification. So social protection, sometimes we are in silos. So we have to work together with people that are specialized in disaster relief and in climate policies, so that we have an integrative approach. So that really helps to make things better. So there are lots of tools that are mechanisms that are quite interesting and can inspire things that we are not used to do, but that we could really include in our planification, like these sensitive mechanisms that we can more easily and more quickly address needs during climate-related events. Social protection can also help with structural changes and really assist also an ecological, a green transition. So there are many lessons to be learned, I think, and I try to give really an overview in that meta paper so that you can really find practical examples of policies that are interesting, techniques that are interesting. And I see it as a work in progress. I'm still open to learn from everybody. So it was really hard to find good examples, practices. And so I continue to collect good practices and interesting cases. So if people attending this do know about some interesting practices, they can always contact me. And so I will try to integrate that in a database so that we have more cases and more practical policies that can inspire other policymakers. So it's all in that paper. As you can see, it has been translated to Spanish, but also to Portuguese. And so, so you can download it and preferably also read it. I hope that you can find it inspiring. And so I will talk later on about Saussure. So I will here close my intervention. Thank you very much.
Gracias a Koen Bleming.
Koen Bleming, thank you so much for your presentation. It was a brief presentation about the most important items of your presentation. Next, Deborah Ruiz has the floor to comment the paper. Thank you so much.
On behalf of the Social Security Board and our chairman, Mrs. Nigeli Sosa, to extend greetings and offer our congratulations to our host as you celebrate Social Security Week. I thank you for the invitation to make this commentary to analyze and discuss Social Security in the climate change context. As you know, I come from a country, Belize, that ranks 8 out of 167 countries for climate risk. Just imagine how applicable this document is for Belize and many other countries facing similar risks. Beyond the challenges are opportunities, and this meta paper entitled Facing Climate Change, How Can Social Protection and Labor and Employment Measures Support Adaptation and Mitigation? Is just that, an opportunity we seek today in responding to these global risks. The document serves as a purposeful guide in charting the way forward for the formulation of policies for social protection in line with climate changes we are experiencing. It serves a meaningful end for the purpose of transitioning into climate change adaptation to exploit new beneficial opportunities for all, and thus come a step closer to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Through its proposals, though some may be somewhat far-fetched for fledgling economies, these could be tailored in some way to guide us in our intent to consolidate social protection for our population. More and more, the issue of climatic change is a reality that is less and less deniable. Our current age has been categorized as a period of mass ecological change, the so-called Holocene extinction. The World Life Fund alludes to this episode in the human narrative as the sixth mass extinction, driven by human activity to the detriment of our resources and ecosystems. Pope Francis, in his recent social encyclical Laudate Deum, categorically states that some effects of the climate crisis, such as increase in the global temperature of the oceans, their acidification, and the decrease of oxygen are irreversible. In terms of exposure and vulnerability, according to parameters established by the World Bank, Belize, as part of the Isthmus of Central America, is the 61st highest exposed country for relative mortality risk from multiple hazards in the world, and ranked 8 out of 167 countries as indicated for climate risks. Belize is also vulnerable to hurricanes, storms, and associated flooding, wind damage, and storm surge, especially along its coastal areas. The country's low-lying terrain exacerbates the effects of flooding and sea level rise, and also susceptible to extreme temperature events, such as acute heat waves that we have experienced lately. As the paper in reference states, the underlying reality is that most of those vulnerable to climate change are those who live close to the coast, having fewer resources to withstand the challenges of climate change. The document proves timely in reminding us of the impending climate change and the challenges that confront us. It is a wake-up call to action in response to a pressing global and social issue that has been denied and relativized. In terms of the failure to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement in 2015 COP21 and the call to action in Dubai 2023 COP25, the fact is clear that the outcome to benefit the whole cannot be achieved at the expense of a few. Further, the strength of the document lies in the context of its call for social protection, labor, and employment. As a proponent and signatory to ILO conventions and recommendations in line with basic universal human rights. Belize, since its independence in 1982, has gradually advanced towards an inclusive vision of being able for well-being for its population. Sorry, the independence was 1981. Such an instrument has been its current scheme of social protection and facilitation of the national health insurance through Social Security. As an incipient move towards social protection, particularly aimed at idiopathic risk, there is much value in that challenge to a broader scope for covariance and longer-term benefits. The COVID-19 pandemic, I should say, proved to be an exercise in trying to minimize the covariant shocks on the nation as a whole. Despite our limitations as a young nation, Social Security was able to meet its sickness-related coverage sickness benefit for COVID-19 related claims, $3.2 million to 7,826 insured persons for a total of 83,155 days of incapacity. Piggybacking from our existing administrative network, we paid out on behalf of our government's unemployment relief program, phase 1, a sum of $34.6 million to 45,000 persons. We utilized 23,000 bank transactions and 13,000 top-up cards and over 8,000 bank cards for our rapid response. Being prone to hurricanes and flooding, Belize has in place a fairly efficient disaster response system operated through our National Emergency Management Organization, NEMO, and its branching management networking that has proven useful in managing covariant crises. A salient recommendation in the paper worth highlighting is the transformative call as the vision for social protection over short-term provisions, which can end up being short-term band-aid solution to the structural scenarios of poverty and vulnerability. Indeed, the transformative function proves to be the challenge in this call for integral social action and subsequent change. The requisites for such are well taken, viz. The need for dialogue involving the state and civil society, including organic and church-based movements within the communal setting, the need for horizontal and vertical expansion that comes in taking responsibility for increased social protection, measures for climate change adaptation, resilience, and disaster risk reduction. It ends up being a matter for the whole village and its leaders to take ownership of these endeavors and a commitment to move with one heart and one mind. The model that is presented in the latter part of the document underscores the need to expand on and transform our insular views on social protection. It presents elements that could prove relevant when revisiting our own scheme of social protection in setting in place effective mechanisms for outreach, being fluid to change, establishing contingency funding for building ecological resilience, and in charting the way ahead towards a green transition. The call to a green transition is the decisive element, I believe, in this model of prevention and transformation. It calls for economic reform in reference to energy subsidies to make room for additional fiscal space designed for employment incentives, development projects, and microcredit programs. The promotion of green jobs through though yet incipient in small economies like ours, becomes part of the overriding challenge towards a change in a culture of consumption and waste. Indeed, as the document states, it is a move that encompasses economic, social, and environmental objectives, which can only be made possible through changes in human attitudes and behaviors at all levels in society. In this regard, the bar could be too high to attain, or we may risk losing ourselves in outlandish over-the-rainbow proposals which can end up being shells, lest we forget that transformation rests upon the individual at the communal level. The success of integral social efforts, more than on policy, rests more on qualitative rather than quantitative results, namely the need to realize that there are no lasting changes without cultural changes, without a maturing of lifestyles and convictions within societies, and that there are no cultural changes without personal changes. I therefore propose to equate the project of a transformational eco-social policy to an integral model in shaping human attitudes and lifestyles in genuinely caring for one another as stewards of our environment. It is integral in that it calls to task the citizenry and its leaders to take ownership of that purpose of providing a safety net constructed by all for the benefit of all and everything. I thank you.
Muchas gracias a la señora Débora
Thank you
Ruiz.
so much, Deborah Ruiz, for your comments to the meta paper. And next, we are going to give the floor to Landy Sanchez.
Muchas gracias, Verónica.
Veronica, thank you so much. I am going to share my screen so I can be on time.
Y también quisiera especificar que los comentarios que voy a
The comments that I am about to express have the idea to discuss the work that you presented to us. The idea is to think about how this model that you have presented to us in the paper can be adapted to us. It's a very provocative paper regarding the possibilities to integrate climate change into social protection matters. My slides are in English, and I am going to be speaking in Spanish. I think that the main contributions of the work that we listened to have to do with highlighting the climate change impacts on people's well-being, particularly of those that are socially vulnerable. It is not doubt that different research all over the world have shown that. So it's no longer a discussion. It's just a matter on how we need to move forward to protect them vis-a-vis this new risk. Social protection is to protect population before several risks in their lives. So how, before this new emerging risk, social protection could mediate and decrease those risks and impacts. And I think this is done clearly in this paper. Besides stating clearly how climate risk should be included and how this should be one of the main purposes for social protection today. And what they are showing us along this text is that we need to move forward in that direction, because there are already some policies all over the world that define how to incorporate this. Yes, of course, we still have some way to go, but in terms on how social protections and policies to promote employment can contribute currently in this time to deal with the most immediate impacts of climate change, but also in the long term, how they can help us to contribute to have capabilities to reduce the effects of climate change and GHG. In global terms, I think that these are the main messages that this paper is presenting to us. So along these components of the text, he is presenting to us how we can deal with this, with that, and how this has been done in different parts of the world. And this is what I am going to do. I am going to focus on some of the ideas to discuss what are the possibilities or the difficulties that these subject matters bring about. So, what does it entail to incorporate climate risk in social protection discussions? Well, first, we need to see how we are going to include concerns about climate change in social policies, because until now they have been separated greatly. We have policies of climate change that are in the environmental field. They have a different set of actors, and they have few discussions with social policies. So all the protection measures have been in a concern about different risks, and they haven't discussed among them. So the main concern is first to understand how to talk together among the main stakeholders that are very different, that have been working independently, how to convince them to get together. And this is not an easy challenge, but it is true that many of the commitments that national governments are making regarding climate change requires to rethink social policies, specifically those that have to do with social protection in every country. There's no way for these two agendas not to meet, but what we need to convey to the community that designs policies for social protection have to do with the nature of climate risk, their magnitude, and their main characteristic, that is uncertainty. One of the main issues that appears with climate change matters have to do with the multiplicity of risk and how they are articulated. If we see a change in temperature, we are going to have a change in the level of humidity, the possibility to have a drought, but it also is going to have an impact in where it's going to happen, where we are going to have events of extreme precipitation. Heat waves are changing as well. So you see multiplicity of events that are occurring in different populations. So the magnitude, the interconnection of events makes even more complicated how we are going to design a policy that is going to protect different populations at the same time in different places in face of different events that require different solutions. So one thing is the dimension, the magnitude of the events, and uncertainty, not about not knowing what is going to happen, but the likelihoods are changing. If before we were expecting to have a drought every 5 years in certain region due to the trends of climate, because those trends are being modified now. Now it's possible for those changes or droughts to be present every 2 years in one area, or in another's every 9 years. So how programs are going to be ready to face that? So they need to be more flexible to respond to this uncertainty, where and how they are going to be presented. The next slide, please. So the CUNE is presenting to us new analytical frameworks, new works to design social policies that will allow us to understand this in a better way. And he is analyzing two frames that have to do with designing social policies that are sensible to climate change matters, and then to protect them. And they have to be adaptive, because before a climate event, they need to respond fast to these incidents, providing services, and outreaching the target populations and having capabilities to respond fast before these multiple demand that social policies can face in a certain moment. Next. The dilemma that we have when we design programs has to do with the type of programs that we need to be designing. For example, if the impact of climate change is not the same in the territory, and we know that, then if we see the first line of this table, what are the areas where we are going to have an impact? For example, drought in Mexico today. We have an extension that has been extended where we see increasingly more drought. So we need to ask ourselves, do we have social programs that are going to be relevant for impacted areas? The higher the coverage, the higher the likelihood that they are going to be present in the areas. Then what is the operational capabilities of those programs? Do they have the capabilities to outreach those populations? And if you go down the line, do they have capabilities to outreach the most vulnerable populations? Not everyone is vulnerable at the same time. For example, agricultural works without irrigation that are located in certain areas with higher levels of temperature, low precipitation, they are going to be more vulnerable. So within these populations that I am covering, can I identify which are more vulnerable for drought? And then can I outreach the housings that are being more affected? Because one thing is the potentially affected and the ones that are really affected. Can I send them the necessary help that they need during these operations? And then one thing is to provide them with effective programs. And another thing is how much I am helping them to build capabilities to respond to droughts in the long term. My social program is doing that. If we have a parallel with other social programs, how much this represent like an unemployment insurance, or if this is an active program where I am going to give other skills, training, so in the future they can reinsert in the labor work if the sector where he used to work disappears. So it's the same logistics. How do we build skills for the future? I'm running out of time. So on one hand, we have an issue. How can we make actionable these social programs so they can be practical regarding climate change? And the third item that I would like to mention is that in the text, they are mentioning there is a stronger emphasis on money transfers. Yes, it is mentioned. They are mentioning other type of actions, but they are mainly talking about monetary transfer in crisis times. Especially in crisis times, what it is used the most, especially in the field of disaster attention, are transfer of goods and services. So we need to have a mixed logic, a money transfer, and oftentimes they need goods and services in a crisis. Let's assume a hurricane that strike over a city that had no market, Otis, for example. Money transfer is not useful because there's no market, there are no things to buy. So it needs to be flexible with the type of transfer that you have to make. So you need to expand the type of supplies that you are going to give. And it has to be differentiated supplied according to the population. An example of a study that we made to protect women and children, and specific vulnerabilities are different. For example, for mother and child care, in droughts, it's necessary because there is a serious impact on food and nutrition. So we need to prevent the increase of mother deaths and also to decrease the violence against girls. So how we are going to outreach certain populations that face specific risk during these times associated to specific crisis. So it's not the same to address flooding than to address a drought or another type of crisis. I don't want to disencourage you, but we need to think about specific policies that we need to define. And we need to be flexible with our program so they can respond to different scenarios that climate change is bringing about. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Landy Sanchez, for your discussion. I think that every intervention has been very interesting. We need to see if there are more comments, if we have some feedback in Zoom. While we review that, let me tell you that we have time for a round of reactions to the comments that the panelists made. So if we don't have yet the questions, I am going to give the floor to Koen so he can answer back to these comments.
If you have questions later on, you can always send me an email or Veronica, and I'll get back to you. And also, if you have interesting cases, please do. Yes. Well, I'm going to tell you about Socieur's activities. So Saussure is a facility financed by the European Commission, like I said, and so implemented by Expertise France, Spain's FIAP, and Belgium's Enable, and Belincostock, which I represent. So Team Belgium, as we call it, is responsible for the coordination of the knowledge development part of Saussure Plus. So, like I said, we have a lot of demand. So, yes. So, sorry. Okay. So Saussure is demand driven. So partners in the 155 partner countries of the EU can submit proposals to Saussure for assistance in the domain of social protection and employment policies. And so that is also a good way to see what is really moving around in the world. So because it is demand driven, we see the points of interest where people are really investing in reforms. And so in that sense, these activities of Saussure, the 600 activities that we have implemented so far, are a good idea, give a good overview of what is actually going around in these 155 partner countries. So that's why the European Commission wanted to valorize this knowledge, the knowledge generated by all these activities, and to generate it and to valorize it in a way that is accessible to experts and policymakers in these 155 partner countries, so that they can be inspired by these activities and also have a good idea of what works and what doesn't. And so the meta paper that I drafted on climate change fitted within that framework. We didn't have many activities on climate change itself, so we had we adapted a more broader tour de horizon to get an idea of what is really going around in policy making in the context of climate change. But at next month, we will make available a meta paper on people with a disability. So the subject is the access of to the labor market and to social protection for people with a disability. And there we have many actions and activities by Saussure that can be of interest. And it's the meta paper is a really good give a really good overview of interesting policies for this specific target group. And so it will also be translated to Spanish and Portuguese, so that you can, as of next month, you can also take a look at that meta report. But there are other subjects in the pipeline. There is also a meta paper being prepared on informal work, which will be available early June. We have implemented lots of activities on informal work, and so there this meta paper tries to give a good overview of the most interesting cases that we have found, and also we try to valorize the expertise that is generated by these activities. A third subject is, fourth subject better, is decent work. So that's also a meta paper that will be made available probably this summer on the policies that help to achieve decent working conditions for all the workers in the different partner countries. So we have lots of activities on that as well. And then I am personally also drafting a meta paper on the access of mothers to the labor market. This paper will be available by the end of June. And in that meta paper, I try to address really the important challenge of how to reconcile both the female labor market participation and the development of family care policies. And in the end, also to inspire policymakers in different partner countries. And I try to group it in different geographical areas. And so, but it's also discussing an important subject of facilitating the choice among mothers and among women to participate in the labor market, because of course, I don't have to share that with, underline that, but of course, women represent an important group. And so the human capital of women is quite crucial for our economies. And in some countries of the world, that is maybe a little bit less recognized than in other countries. And so this facilitating this free choice of women to combine raising a family and to participate in the labor market is very important. And so we have to provide decent access to labor market, childcare provision, social protection for policies that really facilitate families with children. So I think that's really an important form of social investment in society, but also in our economy. So that is the subject that I'm working on at the moment. And I hope to finalize it by the end of May, and then so that we can share it with you by the end of June. So these are the meta reports. But of course, you're all free to contact us at Saussure to formulate proposals for where you request expertise from the European member states. It's of course always in a dialogue. We really try to work together with you. You have lots of expertise yourself, and it's quite of a dialogue to see where we can make the best of the shared experiences that we have to address policy developments in your country. And so we have a staff in Brussels that will be happy to assist you with your proposals. And hopefully then we can work together also in the new activities in Central America and Latin America. So that is really, I think, of interest of everybody here. And so I think, well, please do visit the website of Saussure. It is available in Spanish as well and in Portuguese. So you find lots of information about our activities on the website. You find also knowledge development products. Besides the meta papers, we also have e-learnings. And so you find much more interesting information there on that Saussure website. So thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias por esta panorama
Thank you for this oversight of the work that SocioPlus is doing across different topics that are related to employment. And with this meta paper that we just presented and commented on. Now we will have Deborah Rees, who just raised her hand on Zoom. Can we give her the floor, please?
Thank you. Con, as a follow-up to your presentation, I was just wondering in terms of the what you have seen, a lot of the interventions that you cited in the paper were mostly in terms of the government side contributing. But have you come across examples where the social insurance programs are able to fund some of these interventions? I know we are limited by legislation in terms of the type of programs that we can cover, but is there any options that we can explore to integrate that, or do we go through the public mechanisms in terms of making requests for funding considerations? Or that is my question in terms of the what you have seen on the ground.
Well, social insurance funds and social insurance mutual and so on play an important role within the context of social protection. And I think also like we have an in the context of contingency planning for disaster relief and climate change, I think it would be very wise of policymakers to consult these people working for the social insurance funds and the mutual, because of course they have a lot of experience of policies on the ground. And so their expertise is really valuable in this contingency planning. They themselves, of course, there are many ways where you can also, I think it's important to evaluate what climate change means to you, specifically in that sector where you are working. And so, of course, you have this function within the broader context of, for instance, in context of disaster relief or other, but you can also do, like, for instance, if you're thinking about deliveries of payments of benefits, you see that, for instance, in Japan, they made planifications to make sure that people can still really receive benefits, even if their region is affected by a climate disaster or an earthquake. So they have thought about how to provide their services and their benefits during a situation related to a climate-related disaster. So these are things that you can think about. If you are managing funds and you are managing the investment of funds, there as well you can play a role. And then, for instance, within the context of mitigation, so decarbonizing, you can also try to invest more in sectors of the economy that have a less carbon imprint, and so that you can start thinking about greening your investments as a fund. So that can also be an important contribution that you can make. But it depends really on, in the sector, what are you working on. But it starts first with the reflection and do the exercise and see where you can play a role within the context of climate change.
Thank you very much, Colin.
Muchas gracias. Abrimos.
Thank you very much. And now we have the space open for the Q&A for those in person. Also, I would like... Oh, sorry. I'd like to comment that just as Socioplus has done, we've been talking about the work that we have done as well from the CIS's perspective regarding disaster management with Social Security focus. It is not gratuitous that we have Deborah Ruiz. She's the executive director of the Social Security Board of Belize. We've been working on workshops that members have requested to the conference. In these workshops, we are able to show this perspective of what would be the alternatives to articulate, just as Landy Sanchez was mentioning, between social protection institutions and those other institutions who have had experience in risk management. We've had truly enriching experiences, like in the case of Belize, where we had limited knowledge on how they plan within the strategic planning the financial details to face emergency situations. Just as in the case of Belize, we've had experience, really new experiences. For instance, in Dominican Republic, we have one representative from Dominican Republic who actually shared with us how from the contributive and non-contributive social security aspects they tackled the COVID-19 pandemic and how they managed to increase the coverage to those who are affected due to different circumstances. Also, we have seen that there is this difficulty to achieve dialogue, but we have gained momentum to create this dialogue between management systems and social security systems. And there is a challenge to bring to the table all members of social protection institutions from the non-contributive and contributive side of things. It has been a major challenge to see that the dialogue hasn't happened, but due to COVID-19, regardless of the regime, there was an answer. So it is worth noting this advancement and efforts that the CISS has been performing. And with no further ado and no more questions, I have nothing to say but thank you to our members of the panel. And I would like to remind you that this is an open space for dialogue. And you are welcome to the conversations that we'll have on the future for this and other topics related to social protection. Thank you very much.